The topic I wish to present today is From Overcoming Muteness to the New Social Contract. This topic found this title later. Earlier, I planned to have a very different title. The Imperative of Overcoming Muteness. The imperative of overcoming muteness. So my assumption was that society is mute. That assumption is somewhat Abovianist. If you recall Abovian's Wound of Armenia novel, it's the same question. Society is mute. The people are mute. The people cannot speak. But when comes the moment of danger, when national life is endangered, people's language, people's tongue shall open up. That was one of Abovian's challenges through his book, to open up people's tongue, to unleash the popular tongue. We had the impression that the people were mute. Mute not because they did not speak, but because they did not speak of the things that really are happening in the country. The impression, that was really the impression, because there was in society, or there were two prevailing main discourses. One, the so-called patriotic discourse. So when you speak of national unity, national traditions, when you speak of us being an old nation, of needing to overcome the pressure and oppression of our enemies, all of that is great, but all of that explains little to nothing when we ask what is our society about, what our society is. When we speak of national identity, as a rule, that identity is portrayed as a cultural one, a national historic cultural identity. We speak little about the kind of society we are building. Often I try to cite this example to my students. Surely if you ask a French person about their national prides, they will talk about Jeanne d'Arc, Charles de Gaulle, but eventually they will say they've created now the Human Rights Declaration. They conceived the declaration through which their society lives, but other societies also learn by it, live by it. So when we speak of Vartan Mamikonian and Andranik and the others, I always thought that the question is, what kind of society do you have? How do you raise your children? How do you look after your elderly? How do you organize the change of government? Those questions that the national liberalistic is what I call the patriotic discourse has no answers. The other discourse, then, which is present here and quite widespread, is conditionally called the pseudo-Western discourse. Now, here people are talking of human rights. People are speaking of the market economy. These are great topics, distinguished topics. But then the question is, to what extent are these topics linked to our reality? When I speak of the market economy, I must be certain that that market economy exists here. Now, the model which I'm following, is it really a market-based model, or am I just using it as a smokescreen to cover up certain things? Therefore, that muteness of society is often manifested in chatting much, speaking much. People overspeak to cover up the things that really exist. You may have all noticed people go out on TV and they talk about some odd things, unnatural things. And then you think, well, this is a smart person. Why is this person saying irrelevant things, then you understand that's exactly the point, because they're a smart person. He or she's a smart person and cannot speak of what really is, therefore must speak of all sorts of things to smoke screen up what they are not speaking of, to disguise what they're not discussing. This is what we call muteness, and this is what we then try to overcome. Now, we could say this, fine, we don't have the ideology, but what of sociology? What of actual sociology, actual research? People to field research, people go to the field. I get the impression that that specific sociology doesn't explain much. It fails in explaining a lot, because inside out it is ideological, thoroughly ideological. And that ideology concerns not the political models that are sublime, but that ideology concerns, among other things, the practical sociology. Applied sociology itself is ideological. Because you may think they're not saying anything. There's nothing ideological, no ideological claims. They're describing the reality, but instead, that description of reality is per se ideological, because the question is formulated in a way that the generated answer is the one that they expect. So when I try to understand what is the social construct, social fabric of Armenian society is a society that has to have a structure. In Soviet times, we said there are classes, estates, layers, the intelligentsia, the workers, the farmers. What do we have now, other than the group of taxi drivers? Now, it turns out sociological research provides nothing here. Either they describe things which aren't realistic. If you ask them, 50% of the people are employed in agriculture. What are they doing in agriculture? Nobody knows. But if they live in the village, they're classified as being employed in agriculture. And we just measure it by income. Unlike American society, where the model really works, we see a group of people with middle income, about 300,000, one of whom may be a government official, inside out dependent on the government, getting a salary. The other one may be a high-tech specialist, relatively independent, also getting a 200,000 drum salary. And the third one could be a person without a home or anything, the type you call a bum, a homeless bum, and they may have a cousin who's sending 200,000 drums from Russia per month. So we gain nothing from this analysis. This is why our society remains undescribed, uncharacterized, because of this. In one of the forms of this inadequate description is the very common formulation that emerged back in the day, that is the so-called transition countries language. So we're a country in transition from a Soviet command economy, making a transition to a market-based economy. And it's not by accident. My very good friends last year organized a forum, part of which was in the US, part in Armenia, and that was the title, The End of Transition. I found it very surprising. I wanted to ask, when did we complete the transition? Who says we are close to the end of the transition? Or what happened in this transition? Back in 2007, I wrote a paper, an article, where I raised this very question: a transition to where? And the answer was, I don't know where we are making a transition to, but I know where we're not making a transition to. We're not making a transition to Europe. We are not moving towards Europe. Not because we're not there yet, but because we're on a very opposite track, and we have no real desire to get to Europe. I use the Habermas terms that I should not present here, but there was the suspicion of what? Transition. We have a mixed, hybrid society here, and that hybrid society ought to be studied, ought to be researched. And then it turned out for me later, because in those years I was in diplomacy, so I did not too much research. It subsequently turned out all of that was well known for a long time. Back in 2002, curators published classic article was the end of the transitional paradigm. He doesn't say that the transition to a market economy ended. He said that method of us researchers is over, because we understand that post-Soviet countries need not be discussed in that sense, in that way, because they never make that transition. They're busy doing something else. So let's discuss them in other ways. There are then many other ways and forms, one of which is another interesting article in terms of the title, Beyond the Transition Paradigm. So that's over. What's the next model? There are many models, and people can conceive all sorts of models. In the last forum, he said you can use all sorts of names because political analysts are also humans. They get a salary, and they need to come up with beautiful words and names. But clearly, a model has to be chosen. What is the model we use to characterize Armenia? What do we want to find here? What's hard here is that we cannot do it based on absolutely Western models. Because Western researchers, for a very good reason, are not interested in conceiving theory based on a small country. They compare different countries. They study cases, they generalize, and they come up with a forecast model that provides a panoramic view. But our situation, like any situation, is unique. And we're interested in our uniqueness, our own idiosyncratic case study. A case study where that model is to be adapted and studied and researched to see what comes out of it. I proposed something myself back in the day in a half-joking way. I called our society, in that same article that I cited, 2007, a proper society. The way the word proper is used in TV, proper tape, proper program, proper person, that's proper. Kargin is the Armenian word. A proper society is more or less what the Russians call live by the conception. There's the law, but then there's the conception, the model of conception that you live by. So I thought it would be much more helpful that we spoke of not only the Western models, but the models shaped by our direct, immediate neighbors, because they stand much closer to us. Russian reality is much closer to Armenian reality than America's or France's reality. So when you look at the models of these authors, Kordonsky's research, Naishuli, Auzan, they are often helping us more in researching our reality. So I asked Mr. Kordonsky to participate in this forum, and I'm very grateful that he agreed, and he said it's right there, and he will speak right after me and present his understanding of Russian society. I find it most exciting to follow Simon Kordonsky's analysis and Manvel Sargsyan, whom we all know. I don't know if Manvel is here yet. He'll speak tomorrow. Kordonsky focuses on the administrative market, the resource state, a state-based structure, not class, but a state-based structure of society, because he insists society is not made up of our classes, but estates constructed artificially. The Sargsyan then focuses on the criminal oligarchic system of government in Armenia. Both, I'm very happy, will be among our keynote speakers. Here, when we raised these issues for the agenda, we were aware of the difficulty of the challenge, and that it would be almost insurmountable. How can you describe things you're not allowed to, or you're not supposed to speak about? Not because you get caught, arrested, or shot dead, you just don't speak about those things. I want to quote a very interesting expression by Mr. Kordonsky. He says, reality has mystical features. Mystical not in the sense that divine or irrational, no. In the sense that it's shadow, and you cannot speak of it. His own example, he says, I'm a sociologist, and I'm researching how this company operates. I describe the company and how its modality. 3 people sitting there, 7 people fired, 3 people jailed, the company stops operating. So when you describe the reality, it explodes. It doesn't come to words. It's the presumed but not narrated reality. So we weren't too optimistic about the success of this venture, but the optimists and the pessimists per se were criteria. They were standards. When you say, I'm an optimist, it immediately assumes that you're on the side of the government. You say, I'm a pessimist, you're in opposition. Why? You can have hope that everything is going to be fine. No, you can't have hope, because that system, that corrupt system, is a part of the system. It's a part of the wider system, and it cannot be good. So you realize this system cannot deliver any good, can't change as a matter of principle. So when you say, I'm optimistic, you're falsifying, you're rigging, maybe not consciously, but you're falsifying. We have in the room my good friend Raj Bayadian. Every time somebody said, I'm an optimist, he's really got irritated, because you can't be optimistic, he said. So this is what I wanted to say, and that's why the agenda is built according to the principle of heroic pessimism. Do the most you can. But comes the breakthrough, the program is there, everything is fine, about to start the conference, then comes the revolution. What does the revolution do? The revolution basically solves the problem we wanted to solve in theory. We wanted to show in theory that all of this is fake, that reality is quite different from what's described. You need to describe what exists. But the revolution does it in a matter of a few days. So we face a different challenge. 3 questions. We quickly try to rearrange ourselves. What was, what happened, and what future we expect. I have to apologize for discussing 2 important theoretical terms. The 2 are interconnected. One is legitimacy, and the other one is the social contract. Social contract. So why is legitimacy important? Because in the last 15 to 20 years, everyone in Armenia is speaking of legitimacy. The opposition says, you're not legitimate. And the government says, no, we are legitimate. And all of this, unfortunately, is brought too close to legality. Legitimate is implying that they speak about law and the violation of law. Someone says, you're an offender, you're not legitimate. The other one says, I'm not an offender, I shall prove I didn't break the law, therefore I'm legitimate. It's a discourse of the law. But legitimacy isn't about the law, you see. Legitimacy, as a notion, isn't purely legal. It's psychological and social. It's a phenomenon that demonstrates how power is perceived in society. And if you're perceived as not good, not fit, unfit, you cannot prove that from a formal standpoint of law you did things right. I don't believe you, period. So legitimacy is about that. You're not legitimate. And that was comic in this whole revolution where people rise up, and a group of people in the parliament are saying, let us see your program, we will discuss your program, you can prove, and we'll formally prove we're right. Well, for God's sake, we've got nothing to discuss with you, you're not legitimate. So legitimacy becomes crucial. Short of it, society does not exist, simply fails to exist. So legitimacy here ties to something very important. Society's readiness to abide the power, readiness to abide the authorities. If you accept they're legitimate, then you're ready to abide. If you don't find them legitimate, you're not ready to abide. So legitimacy ties to another important notion. That notion is in the social contract. For the formal thinkers, social contract is just as mystical as legitimacy. They say, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes all say that humans created a social contract. Where? When? Where did these boys come together and sign this social contract? Oh, well, sometimes that does happen. The lords forced King John, and he signed the Charter of Rights, the Bill of Rights, but not always. It's not about people coming together and signing a paper. It's about something totally different. It's about people having a certain perception of what society should be like. They have this conviction. And if society diverges, right, if it doesn't diverge, if it meets this expectation, they're ready silently, mutely to abide. As Raymond Goss calls it, tacit consent. It's the tacit, direct, silent consent. You agree? Okay, so you agree. Now, therefore, there should be that contract. But what is the contract we had in Armenia? Did we ever have such a contract? As we know, there are two types of contracts. Horizontal, which are the most optimal, and Locke says it, and Rousseau says it. And there can be vertical ones. Not a contract within the people, but a contract between the people and the leader. And that means that the leader then has an authoritarian approach, governs people from the top. But the contract is, I give you something, I take something from you. I take from you the political freedoms, and in return, I'll give you something. I'll give you something in return. What is that you have to give to me? Alexander Rozan, when he discussed the situation in Russia, said two things, as a rule, were proposed under a vertical contract. First, the immunity of property. I guarantee that your property shall be untouched, immune. That fell apart after the Yukos case. And the second, social guarantees. From the top, I give you social guarantees. The poor, the pensioners, according to Mr. Auzan, this fell apart when the social privileges in Russia were monetized. There's a third one, but we'll discuss it later. When we speak of Armenia, we assume Armenia, more or less in the same situation, therefore it should have had that vertical contract. Or what was the contract to guarantee perhaps three expectations. One, certain social guarantees. Another, immunity of property. And thirdly, and very importantly for us, a country at war, national security. Security in war matters. The question comes up, to what extent are these three guaranteed in Armenia? Without dwelling upon this too much, as I don't have much time, Mr. Manvel Sargsyan carried out brilliant analysis, and I hope that tomorrow, when he speaks, he will allude to it. There are parts that I will just post on the website that you can read where he showed that an interesting thing happened in Armenia. He thinks it's the only post-Soviet country, and maybe it is, in which authoritarianism has been overcome. Armenia stopped being authoritarian. All the others remain authoritarian. Armenia isn't. Why? Because according to Ashot Voskanyan, when the presidential power was weakened in 2003 under Robert Kocharyan, the weakening of authoritarianism meant some internal agreements among the oligarchic groups about ways of distributing the leverages and the economic spheres and the political influence. The president was left only with coordinating and the role of coordinating these circumstances. Such a model, which is the criminal oligarchic model, no longer is authoritarian. It's not a top-down one. So they needed to have given these guarantees. And Ashot Voskanyan then concludes that the presentation of these guarantees was a specific point in time. In 2003, on the 11th of June, when the coalition government memorandum was signed, there was a distribution. This is for you, and that's for you, and this is for me. Now then, we will not know fully the distribution that took place, but this was followed by the criminal oligarchic system, not an authoritarian one. Now we say 2003, June is when this happened. Alexander Auzan then says the same happened in the fall of 2003 in Russia, where they brought together the business representatives and they asked them, hey guys, who do you have a problem with, the president or the people? And they said the people. So the question was posed about the need for a social contract. Large business should agree or needs to agree to give something, create funds, give guarantees to people, otherwise the system will not linger. But it failed to happen in Russia because the power was transferred to the president. People accepted the presidential model, different from Armenia. But when this happened in Armenia, and we gained, quote unquote, this criminal oligarchic system, the question we ask is, within the social contract, the assumed privileges, what did these people give to society? Three things. These people were to provide social guarantees. They did not give social guarantees, and Marvel really writes about this very nicely, because the criminal oligarchic system is all about enslaving its citizens at most. So growth, economic growth, that might have even taken place, did not benefit society in terms of prosperity, better prosperity. Prosperity and growth are not related. And the second is immunity of property. We know there's no immunity of property because property constantly got reallocated by force, by power, taken from one, given to the other. So that guarantee is lacking. A third potential guarantee would have been national security, but in the 4-day war, that evaporated, let alone this Manuel Grigorian arrest of the general story. But the 4-day war demonstrated that these guarantees aren't there. The conclusion, therefore, is that over the course of the years, starting from the 2000s, we've reached a point where in Armenia, no social contract whatsoever existed. None. Which is what created the protest. If we link legitimacy to the contract and we say people are ready to abide, There's the famous book, Freedom for Sale, which is about how we earned money and sold our freedom. People can sell their freedom because they earn money, they get security, but you're getting nothing. That's what leads to the victory of the revolution. Because of the network campaign, which visibly demonstrated the truth that was long known in society. In the absence of a social contract, the vast majority of the Armenian population did not see any argument for abiding the incumbent regime. See, the interesting thing is not about you violating or breaking the law, it's about you not believing the law from within, not believing those under the law and not believing those above the law. Weber says something really nice here. He says, legitimacy is the adoption of the law. It has nothing to do with the violation. The thief who violates law, but he accepts that there's a law. He tries to avoid getting caught. The law is there. The law is legitimate. But what happened in Armenia wasn't that you were lied to. You weren't. They are telling you something. They know you don't believe it, and they don't have a problem. They don't care that you don't believe it, and you know that they don't believe, and you know that you don't believe. So it's all conditionality. Nothing works. Happens this, what Weber calls organized boycott. He says there are two ways of struggling against this illegitimacy. One is if you're in the public domain, it's the boycott, and the other, if you're in the legal domain, it's pressure. Force structures. Anything in the interim is the organized boycott. All of society boycotting the government that claims to rule and wishes to deliver nothing. Why was force not used? I can't answer that question. Mr. Leon asked that question. Why was force not used? Many of us ask this question. Why did they not kill Nicole, to be blunt? Lauzan has this nice explanation. He says, why is force often not used? Because he says, it means you have to move to totalitarian government. Totalitarian government is hard, it's expensive, it's tough, it's complicated. You need a huge repressive machine, you need a strong machine, you need a large machine. The borders need to be closed. And if it's controlled from one place, it's possible, but in an oligarchic system where everyone is chasing their interests, who's going to control it? Who's going to manage it? So that's not too acceptable. So the final question I wish to pose here, as I feel I'm out of time, is as follows. Ways of reconstructing the social contract. Stepan said we can feel enthusiastic and happy about the fight against corruption and about trying to get everyone back under the law, and that's the first example. But the next question is, for what? For what to happen? What is it happening for? If we want the government to remain legitimate for a long time, and if we want it to be not only because of the charismatic legitimacy of the leader, but a truly rule of law-based legitimacy, the question we ask is what type of social contract we want to have in Armenia. And I think that contract must be based on the notion of fairness, justice, for the simple reason that because of our past, our history, Soviet legacy, our people demand first of all justice and fairness, and justice becomes crucial. So we need to acknowledge that as much as we may like to have a horizontal contract, to a large extent, the contract to be restored in Armenia will one way or another be vertical. It's going to be a vertical contract, and it's going to pose the following questions. Social guarantees, to begin with. And the second one that contradicts this first one guarantees of ownership. But if you provide guarantees of ownership, how do you give guarantees of ownership if people are saying, take it away from them, give it to us, they are thieves? It's the conflict you need to address. How can we create a system in which the wealthy will not be undermined, but they will know that they owe to the others? And that's the toughest system. And thirdly, safeguard military protection. To conclude this speech, I want to recall an anecdote from the 1988 movement. At the Mergelian Institute, a party worker went into the Mathematics Institute, started to make speeches. Someone came up and said, you know what? You no longer speak to us like that. I don't know how you're going to speak to us from now on. It's your problem. Go figure it out. But this way, never again talk to us like this. We are different today. That difference wasn't maintained fully. But today I would very much like no longer to be spoken to in that way. And it's up to us. It's contingent upon us. Thank you.